All right, well, joining me on the line today is an American businessman, an investor, a traveler, a financial commentator, and an author based in Singapore. His name is Jim Rogers. You know him well. He's been a guest on our program, and he has quite a following online as well. Jim, it's really great to have you back on Follow the Money Radio. Welcome.
Well, Jerry, I'm delighted to be here. It's a great pleasure.
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Absolutely. Well, you know, if you listen to the corporate media here in the United States, you will hear about America's rising economy, record unemployment levels, and a stock market that's at new all-time highs. But what the media here in the U.S., Jim, really hardly ever reports is the fact that America's debt levels are also rising. So on one hand, you have Trump's policies that are stoking the animal spirits, and they're driving many asset prices higher as economic growth appears to be accelerating. But then on the other hand, you have Trump leveraging the U.S. to the gills with a surging national debt. You have $1 trillion deficits, and no plan to solve America's entitlement crisis. So, Jim, what do you make of the Trump administration's handling of the economy during his first 2 years in office? Is it wonderful? Is it terrible? Is it somewhere in between?
Well, Jerry, as you well know, if you give me $1 trillion, I'll show you a very, very good time. Give me $2 trillion, and I'll show you twice as good a time. No, that's what's going on. Your insight is very good. Staggering amounts of debt is being created, even more than in the past. And who would have thought it possible that we could build up even more debt than before? But we are, and it's going into markets. But as you probably know, not all stocks are going up. In fact, a great number of stocks are going down, and other countries in the world are not participating like we are in the U.S. stock market. So underneath, there seem to be more problems, underneath there are more problems developing.
You know, if America really wanted to slow its inevitable decline, what are some practical steps that it can take, Jim? I mean, maybe asked in a different way, if you were suddenly given the economic reins, you were given the trillions of dollars of the American taxpayers' money, what actions would you take to put this country back on a more sustainable economic path? What can be done?
Well, things can be done, but I suspect I would be assassinated within 6 months if I started doing them. Someone has to cut spending with an axe, not with an axe, with a chainsaw. Someone has to cut taxes. We have a gigantic litigation problem in the U.S., which is costing lives. Partly because of the litigation problem, we spend 2 or 3 or 4 times as much on health care as any other nation in the world, and yet we're not even in the top 25 for life expectancy. We spend huge amounts of money on education, and yet we're not even in the top 25 for education results. I mean, I could go on and on and on. One of the reasons we have this huge balance of trade deficit is because the high cost of healthcare, litigation, and many other things in the U.S. cuts our competitiveness a great deal. So our problems are not because all these foreigners are evil and unfair. It's because we have deep, basic problems in the U.S. that no one is addressing.
Are you surprised that the former Tea Party types, the former fiscal conservatives, have fallen silent in this era, or just chalk it up to politics?
Well, I presume, and I don't know, I haven't thought about it, but I presume it's politics. Their alternative is Bernie Sanders or somebody, and they don't want Bernie Sanders. Trump is perhaps better than or less bad than the alternative, but I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's turning to China, because you've had a lot to say about China over the years. You've spoken at length about the rise of China, why the U.S. is largely unprepared because of its over-reliance on leverage, its specialization in consumption, not production. And Trump has clearly gotten the memo that China is the primary threat to American economic supremacy. You can tell that by many of the guys he has surrounding him. And my question relates to Trump's current economic war on China. I heard Alibaba CEO Jack Ma recently state that he believes that the current U.S.-China trade war could drag on for up to 20 years. What do you make of Trump's current approach to China? And perhaps as a follow-up to that, what do you make of China's retaliatory response to the U.S.? What do you make of this trade war?
Well, trade war, no trade war has ever been good for anyone in history. No one has ever won a trade war. Even people not directly involved suffer when there are trade wars. I don't know if Mr. Trump knows history or even cares about history. He thinks he's smarter than history. He thinks he can control history, is all I can figure. But I know of no time when a trade war has done any good for anybody other than perhaps a few people for a short period of time. So no, this is not good. I know that he has a couple of guys around him who love to bash China. They blame everything. The main guy, I forget his name now, but 30 years ago he was going on and on about how free trade was good, et cetera, et cetera. Now he lost a few political elections, and so I guess he's trying to get a name for himself by now bashing China. But, well, for whatever reason, yes, China has become the focal point. The poor Chinese save and invest 35% of their income, while we save and invest 2% of our income. They educate and discipline their children, and so they're being bashed as some kind of evil guys. I wish we educated and disciplined our children. I wish we saved 30 to 35% of our income things in the U.S. But for whatever reason, the Chinese are getting bashed. I'm sure that there are some things that they are not doing properly. But it's not. The basic answer to your question is this is not good for anybody, and it's not good for the United States. One thing I have certainly noticed living here in Asia now is that Mr. Trump is making China great again. A lot of what he's doing is good for China and not good for the U.S. And yet somehow or another he thinks by smashing China is helping us in the U.S. I see it every day that it's helping China in Asia, where we should be the dominant influence, but we're losing our position.
So true. As you see the Silk Road progress, the Belt and Road Initiative, you see a lot of the chess game that's going on in the Southeast or in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, you see the Philippines, Thailand. We could go down the list and look at all of the different players that are in play. How effective have U.S. policies really been recently in your mind of managing, let alone slowing, China's ascent as well as America's descent? You know, your thesis is that America is descending. I totally agree. Your thesis is also that China is ascending, and I agree as well. How much has Trump changed that equation? Has he changed it at all through his policies?
Well, I don't like saying that America's descending since I'm an American and my children are voters and taxpayers, et cetera. But America is now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and the debts are going higher. They're not going down. China is the largest creditor nation in the history of the world right now. I mean, they have their own problems, I assure you, and there'll be more problems coming in China. But the situation is such that China's rising and we're declining. Jerry, I don't like saying this at all, but we all have to face facts or we'll go down the tubes too. Mr. Trump has thrown out the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which shocked everybody in Asia, mainly because that left Asia open to China. Before America was dominant, and then all of a sudden Mr. Trump pulled out of Asia, and everybody looked to their left and their right, and they said, "Well, who's left?" And there was China, moving in quite happily. They're doing many things, but don't think China's not going to have problems. I don't want to get off too much on this. China's building up debt itself now. There are problems developing in China, and so next time we have world problems, China's going to have problems too. But fortunately, or I think fortunately, Beijing has said they're going to let people go bankrupt when they get into trouble. I hope so. It'll be good for China. It'll be good for the world. I wish in America and in Europe and in Japan they would let people go bankrupt when they get into trouble instead of bailing everybody out.
You had mentioned that the trade wars just historically have always failed. I would assume you expect the same from this trade war between U.S. and China. We really don't learn from economic history, and economic history is filled with lessons for us. How do you see this current foray kind of coming to an end? Do you foresee Trump gaining victory and walking away victorious, feeling some sense of victory, or do you think that China will keep up the retaliation as long as necessary? Will one buckle quickly, in your opinion, or do you think this is a long game?
Well, there's no such thing as winning a trade war. Even the people who think they win do. You see what's happening with NAFTA right now. Mr. Trump is shouting from the rooftops that he's won, but you look at the results, it means that the price of cars is going to go up a lot for American citizens. I'm not sure how that's good for America. Maybe it's a good for a few automobile workers, but it's not good for most Americans. When we sell millions, we buy millions of cars every year. The price is going to go higher and higher, etc. The price of washing machines, the price of everything made of steel, is going to go higher and higher now. So, have we won that? He says we have. I'm not sure of his definition of winning. As far as the specifics of the Chinese trade war, what I suspect will happen is that at some point along the line, something's going to happen, and Mr. Trump and China are both going to say, okay, now we've resolved this. And Trump, of course, is going to say he won. But then when things do get really tough, a year or two from now in the world economy, Mr. Trump is going to come back with a real serious trade war, and there's not going to be any compromise or anything else. That will undoubtedly last a long time. You may remember in 1929, America passed Smoot-Hawley. Well, it took decades. We had a gigantic depression. We had a gigantic war. We had many, many problems resulting from that. So yes, Jack Ma is probably right. One way or the other, this is not going to be good for the world for a long time. In the 19th century and even early part of the 20th century, we had opening markets. Everybody, there was free trade, free movement of capital, more or less free movement of people, and the world had a fabulous period. The First World War, of course, interrupted that, but even after the First World War, America had its best economic decade in history. But then people started closing off, led unfortunately by the U.S., and the rest is history. Depression, war, etc. Rise of communism. Everybody loved it except you and me and everybody and most citizens.
Jim, I mean, you bring up a lot of things, and there is a lot to be depressed about as we look around the world, even now in 2018. But where there is crisis, there's also opportunity, and I know that you have a few areas of the world that you're excited about. What excites you as you look around the world? You've traveled around the world. You've done it twice. You've seen the world in a way that most people have never been able to experience it or see it. And so that, coupled with your investment background and your understanding of history, is just so valuable. And so what excites you, Jim Rogers, as you look around the world? The opening of North Korea, I would assume, is one.
Well, of course, that's very, very exciting. Korea is going to be the most exciting country in the world for 10 or 20 years once North Korea is open and they unite. It's going to be very exciting for many, many reasons. When you find depressed, as recently as 1970, North Korea was richer than South Korea. Well, communism can ruin anything, and does. Communism ruins everything, and so it ruined North Korea, which means that North Korea is extremely cheap. Lots of educated, disciplined, cheap labor there, lots of natural resources right on the Chinese border, combined with lots of capital in the South, lots of know-how in the South. It's going to be very exciting. The Japanese are against it because Japan knows they cannot compete with an open Korea, and they're doing their best. There's not much they can do. I mean, Mr. Abe keeps shouting about 14 Japanese who apparently were kidnapped 40 years ago, because he doesn't have much else to shout about to stop this. So that will be very exciting. I usually perk up when I see disasters. I don't perk up when I see a stock market at all-time highs like in the U.S., but the Chinese market is down 60%. Japan market is down 50% from its all-time high. Russia's hated. Zimbabwe has just thrown out a absolutely absurd dictator who ruined the country for 40 years. Great opportunities there. I've recently invested in a little bit, not much, Zimbabwe. Ghana was ruined. Ghana is changing dramatically. They have really smart, knowledgeable people running Ghana now. Colombia was in civil war for 40 or 50 years. I have learned in my life that if you go to a place after a war or after a civil war, there are huge opportunities. Everything's cheap. Everything is ignored, and new capital can do wonders in a country like that. So there are certainly opportunities around the world. Agriculture has been a nightmare for over 30 years now. Agriculture has been so bad that the average age of farmers in America is 58. In Japan, it's 66. I mean, I can go on and on about the nightmare of agriculture for the past 30 or 40 years. So there are great opportunities there. There are always opportunities somewhere, Jerry, but usually not when the market's making all-time highs.
Yeah, totally agreed. Interesting, especially on Africa. There does seem to be so much opportunity there that's just latent that we'll certainly see in the next several decades, and even now for those who can access that.
Excuse me, I just want to interrupt 1 second about that.
Sure.
Speaking of Africa, you may or may not know that the Chinese have poured into Africa.
Oh, sure.
I mean, it's staggering. They've invited the presidents of all African countries to Beijing several times. They all show up. The leaders of China have been all over Africa in the last few decades. I think maybe American presidents have made 1 or 2 visits in the last few decades, and only to a few countries. Everywhere you go in Africa now, the Chinese are there pouring in huge amounts of investment. So I'm afraid that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're all going to look back and say, how'd the Chinese get Africa? What happened? Why aren't we influential in Africa anymore? So, I mean, we're shooting ourselves in the foot in a lot of places by inaction or by incorrect actions. Sorry, go ahead. You were saying.
I can't agree with you more. I really can't, because I see the same exact picture. I see a United States that seems to be one step behind the Chinese. It's almost as if the Chinese have. It's almost as if they've done this before, Jim. It's almost as if they're not a stranger to empire or something. They've done this before. They have they have 5,000 years of history, and they certainly have a motivation to take back what they believe is rightfully theirs. And the United States seems to have rested on its laurels for a while, and it seems as if it's playing catch up now. Perhaps President Obama was not as aggressive as maybe he should have been at anticipating this. But it certainly seems that Trump has, as I said, gotten the memo, but maybe his tactics are a dollar short, maybe a day late.
Yeah. I can't blame it all on Mr. Obama, although I used to think that Bush would go down as the worst president in American history, and then along came Obama, who was even worse. So, and Trump, of course, remains to be seen. But no, we have a lot of guys in Washington who are responsible for this, both sides of the aisle. It's been a mess.
You're listening, by the way, to the voice of Jim Rogers. He's our guest today on Follow the Money Radio. He is an American businessman. He's an investor, a well-known investor and traveler, a financial commentator, and an author, and he's based in Singapore. Jim, in our final moments, we recently discussed at our Follow the Money Summit we do every year, the world's greatest traders. We went back in history and talked about guys like Jesse Livermore and Gerald Loeb and Bernard Baruch and Nicholas Darvis, and many of these guys who, really just took a real unorthodox approach to Wall Street. And Jim, I think many in our audience consider you to be one of the greatest traders in recent times as well, retiring financially independent in your 30s after extracting large profits from the financial markets. What are some of the wisdom keys that you could maybe leave with us that you've discovered in your journey with trading and investing, particularly for those who are new investors or new traders? What are some wisdom keys that you can pass on to the new trader or the new investor?
Well, the first wisdom key is that I'm not one of the great investors. So whatever it was you said, no, now you got me confused with somebody else. I'm just a simple person from the backwoods of Alabama who tried to make a little money in the world. But the main things, I've got a couple of young daughters. I'm trying to teach them to be curious. It's very few people are really seriously curious. They say they're curious, but they're not. I try to teach them to think independently. Most people just turn on the internet or the television, and that's the answer. They've got to learn to think independently, and they've got to be skeptical. They've got to learn not to listen to what they see. And one way to do that, of course, is to get information from various sources. Read the left, read the right, watch the left, watch the right, watch everybody. Watch people who are hated by the conventional wisdom. They may be wrong, but at least they're gonna make you think. And once you process and think independently, then you might come up with some good ideas, especially if you find things that are cheap. Things that are ignored or hated are usually very, very cheap, partly because they're ignored and hated. Well, often that's where you find things changing. And if you can find something that's very cheap where there's positive change taking place, you're probably going to be very successful no matter what your field of endeavor, whether it's writing, movies, politics, sports, anything, investing. That's where if you do things your own independent way, it's hard. It's very hard, Jerry. It's very hard if everybody's shouting and running in one direction. It's hard to say, wait a minute, what are they doing? Or they're crazy. That's hard to do. But if you can do it, then chances are you're going to be very successful.
Words of wisdom from our guest, Jim Rogers. Jim, in our very final moment here, if people want to learn more about you, your companies, your work, how can they do in your books? How can they do so? What's the best way to do that?
Well, Jerry, I don't have any clients or anything. I don't have anything to sell. I have done a few books. I guess they could buy my books. I go on the internet and hear a few interviews with smart people like you. I don't have anything to sell, I'm afraid. Or you can buy my books.
Absolutely.
That's about all.
On Amazon.com for sure. Well, fantastic. Well, we'll provide links to your books in today's show notes. Jim, it's always a pleasure. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jerry. Let's do it again sometime. Bye-bye.